A new day, or rather, the faintest sliver of light struggling to pierce through the grime-coated window panes. Let's just say Alara's bed wasn't exactly a plush, cloud-like haven. Imagine, if you will, a thin, straw-filled mattress, likely harboring more than its fair share of unseen companions. We're talking bedbugs, fleas, the occasional adventurous rodent, a whole ecosystem thriving in the threadbare fabric. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Comfort wasn't exactly a priority in this line of work, or really for most of the population back then. Alara's lodging, generously put, was a small room above an establishment. Think of it as a multi-purpose building. Downstairs, the lively tavern buzzed with patrons seeking ale, gossip, and perhaps a bit of distraction from their own dreary lives. Upstairs was where Alara and the other women earned their keep. The room itself was sparsely furnished. Besides the aforementioned mattress, which, let's be honest, was more like a glorified sack of straw, there was a rickety wooden stool, often missing a leg and leaning precariously. A chipped wash basin sat on a small, equally unsteady table, next to a cracked pitcher of water. Hopefully, it was relatively clean water. Hygiene was another challenge we'll delve into later. Forget about privacy. The walls were thin, offering little in the way of soundproofing. Alara could hear the raucous laughter and drunken singing rising from the tavern below, and she knew the other women in their equally cramped rooms were likely going through similar awakenings. There was a certain camaraderie in that shared experience, a silent understanding of the daily grind they all faced. But let's get back to the bed, because that's where our story begins for the day. The straw, long past its prime, poked and scratched, offering little in the way of support. Every movement rustled and crinkled, a constant reminder of the less than luxurious conditions. A single worn blanket provided minimal warmth against the morning chill. Remember, there was no central heating here, no fluffy duvets, no electric blankets, just a thin layer of coarse wool separating her from the cold. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It was a unique blend, a potent cocktail of stale ale, unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and a hint of desperation. The aroma of the tavern permeated everything, clinging to the walls, the furniture, even Alara's own clothes. It was the scent of survival, the olfactory signature of her profession. Waking up each morning wasn't exactly a joyous occasion. There was no snooze button, no gentle alarm clock. The reality of her life hit her hard and fast, a cold slap in the face. She knew what the day held, the endless parade of customers, the forced smiles, the emotional and physical toll of her work. And yet, there was a certain resilience in Alara, a spark of something that hadn't been completely extinguished by her circumstances. Perhaps it was a flicker of hope, a dream of something better, or simply the will to survive, to make it through another day. This wasn't a life she had chosen, not really. Circumstances, poverty, lack of opportunity, these forces had conspired to push her down this path. But she wasn't defined by her profession, not entirely. There was more to Alara than just the label society had slapped on her. As she slowly sat up, the aches and pains settled in. Her muscles were stiff and sore from the previous day's work. She was tired, bone-tired, but she knew she couldn't afford to linger. The city wouldn't wait for her. The bills wouldn't pay themselves. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the room, revealing the cracks in the walls, the dust motes dancing in the air, the sheer shabbiness of her surroundings. It was a far cry from the idyllic life she might have once dreamed of, but it was her reality, and she would face it, head on, just like she faced every other day. This was just the start of her day, with the first thing being the awful bed. Alara's reality of being a prostitute was much, much harder than what the customers saw. All right, settle in, folks. Let's talk about smell. Specifically, the smell of survival back in medieval times. It wasn't exactly roses, was it? Let's imagine our friend Alara, just for a minute. She's waking up, maybe not feeling her best. But what's the first thing that hits her? It's definitely not a freshly brewed latte. It's the potent, shall we say, aroma of the medieval city. Think of it as a concentrated cocktail of everything organic breaking down, all the time, everywhere. Now we need to understand that personal hygiene wasn't exactly a priority back then. Not for lack of wanting, of course, but just a complete lack of infrastructure, and frankly the time. Bathing was rare, very rare, like maybe once a month, if you were lucky, rare. Most people simply didn't have access to clean water in sufficient quantities, or the means to heat it. And when you're working dawn till dusk, just to stay alive, a leisurely soak in a tub is pretty low on the to-do list. So imagine layer upon layer of, well, sweat, dirt, grime, unwashed clothes. It all kind of melds together, and everyone else around you is in the same boat, so it's just a pervasive background scent. A sort of human musk, if you will, only far less appealing. And speaking of clothes, they weren't exactly getting laundered daily. Think wool, linen, maybe some rough hemp. These fabrics are absorbent, sure, but they also trap everything. And washing, a laborious process involving lye, which is pretty harsh stuff, and lots of scrubbing. So clothes were worn until they were practically falling apart, or actively attracting vermin. But the personal smell was only part of the problem. Sanitation, or the distinct lack thereof, really contributed to the overall olfactory experience. Remember, there weren't any sophisticated sewer systems. Human waste was often tossed directly into the streets. Gardiloo. They'd yell from the windows before emptying the chamber pots. That was the medieval equivalent of looking both ways before crossing the street. Helpful, but not entirely effective. Animal waste was also everywhere. Horses, oxen, pigs, chickens, they all did their business wherever they pleased. And since these animals were essential for transportation, farming and food, they were a constant presence in the city. So you had a delightful mix of human and animal excrement baking in the sun, fermenting in the rain, and generally just contributing to the ambience. And then there was the food, or rather the remnants of it. Butchering was often done in the open, so you had blood and offal attracting flies, and, well, you get the picture. Food waste was also just tossed into the streets, or onto communal middens, which were basically giant compost heaps that bred disease and attracted every rat in a 5-mile radius. Speaking of rats, they were a constant problem. They thrived in the unsanitary conditions, spreading disease and generally making life miserable. And let's not forget the other vermin. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, they were just part of daily life. Itchy, irritating, and potentially deadly, but unavoidable. And what about the trades? Tanning, for example, was a particularly pungent profession. The process of turning animal hides into leather involved soaking them in urine, dung, and various other delightful concoctions. Tanners were often relegated to the outskirts of the city, but the smell permeated everything. Then there were the dyers, using natural dyes derived from plants, insects, and even shellfish. Some of these processes involved fermentation and other smelly chemical reactions. The cloth, once dyed, also retained some of the odors, so walking down the street, you might catch a whiff of indigo, or madder, or even crushed snails. And let's not forget the lack of refrigeration. Meat and fish spoiled quickly, creating a constant background odor of decay. Spices were used to mask the smell and taste of slightly off food, which is why medieval cuisine often seems so heavily seasoned to our modern palates. So what was it like for Alara, navigating this smelly world? Well, she probably got used to it. Sensory adaptation is a powerful thing. After a while, you just stop noticing certain smells, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means she learned to filter them out, and she probably had her own strategies for coping. Maybe she carried a posy of herbs to mask the worst of the odors. Maybe she tried to avoid certain streets or neighborhoods known for their particularly offensive smells. Maybe she just held her breath and kept moving. But the smell was always there, a constant reminder of the realities of medieval life. It was the smell of survival, the smell of poverty, the smell of disease, the smell of a world without modern sanitation. It was a smell that we, thankfully, can only imagine. But for Alara, it was just another part of her day, another obstacle to overcome in her struggle to survive. So sweet dreams, folks, and maybe light a candle or something nice before you drift off, just in case. Morning, or perhaps it's merely less dark. Time has a way of blurring, doesn't it? Especially when sleep offers such fleeting respite. The straw mattress rustles beneath me, a familiar symphony of discomfort. My bones ache, a dull throb that reminds me of the previous days. But before the world truly intrudes, before the smells and sounds of the city assault my senses, there's a brief, fragile moment, a space for thought. Now, you might imagine that a woman in my profession wouldn't be much for contemplation. That survival leaves little room for pondering the mysteries of the universe. And, well, you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but even amidst the grit and the grime, the fleeting encounters and the ever-present dangers, there's a flicker of something. Hope, resignation, perhaps just plain curiosity. The first ritual is simply to breathe deeply, filling my lungs with the surprisingly crisp morning air that manages to find its way even into the grimmiest corners of the city. It's a small act, but it anchors me, reminds me that I am indeed alive. Then comes the cleansing, a splash of cold water from the ewer. It stings my skin, but it also awakens me, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep and the lingering memories that often cling to the night. There's no soap, of course. That's a luxury far beyond my reach. But the water, it's enough to feel somewhat human again. As I rub the sleep from my eyes, my gaze falls upon the small wooden crucifix hanging above my bed. It's a simple thing, crudely carved, a gift from a long time ago, a reminder of a life different. And here's where the battle begins within myself. Prayers or profanities? Which will win the first part of the morning? Do I offer up a prayer to someone, something, for forgiveness, for protection, for a better day? Perhaps a prayer for a miracle, for a way out of this existence? Or do I curse the heavens, rail against the unfairness of it all, denounce the hypocrisy of a world that condemns women like me while simultaneously indulging in our services? Honestly, it depends on the day. Sometimes the words of the Ave Maria rise unbidden to my lips, a desperate plea for solace. I remember the nuns at the convent, their gentle faces, their hushed voices as they guided us through the scriptures. I remember the feeling of belonging, of being worthy. But then the memories of what I've done, what I've had to do, crash down on me. The faces of the men, the whispered words, the emptiness, and the prayers catch in my throat, turning into bitter, silent accusations. And the profanities, they come easily. A string of curses learned on the streets, a venting of frustration and anger that feels strangely liberating. It's like a release of pressure, a raw, honest expression of my dissatisfaction. And if I were being entirely honest, I think I do both, mixing prayers and curses together in a confused, whispered babble. Perhaps someone, somewhere, can sort it all out. It's difficult to reconcile the conflicting aspects of my life. The girl I once was, the woman I am now, the yearning for something more, the acceptance of my current reality. Some would say that I am damned, that my soul is lost, that there is no redemption for a woman like me. And perhaps they are right. But I cling to the hope that even in the darkest corners, even in the most degraded circumstances, there is still a spark of humanity, that even I am capable of goodness. Perhaps it's foolish, perhaps it's naive, but it's what keeps me going. As I sit here staring at the crucifix, I can't help but wonder, what happened? How did I get here? I remember a time when I had dreams, ambitions. I wanted to be a seamstress, a baker, a wife. I see those happy futures flicker and fall like failing fireflies. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A cruel twist of fate, a moment of desperation, a series of unfortunate choices. And here I am. But maybe, just maybe, there's still time to reclaim something, to salvage a piece of my lost self, to find a flicker of light in the darkness. It's a long shot, I know. The odds are stacked against me. The world is not kind to women like me, but I have to try. I have to believe that even a medieval prostitute can be worthy of some semblance of redemption. So I rise, take a long final breath, and prepare to face the day. A day filled with uncertainty, danger, and the ever-present struggle for survival. But also, perhaps, a day filled with unexpected moments of grace. Prayers or profanities, I don't know. Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. But I know one thing for sure. I will keep breathing, keep thinking, keep trying. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. And with a heavy heart, and a bit more hope, I step forward into the light. Alright, let's settle in and talk about something quite essential to life. Especially a life like Ilara's bargaining and bread, or more accurately, bargaining for bread and everything else she needs to survive. Now, Ilara isn't exactly rolling in coin, is she? So she can't just waltz into the market and buy whatever catches her eye. Every penny counts. Every transaction is a negotiation. Think of it like this. Ilara's life is one big, ongoing, let's call it resource management simulator. First thing to remember about the medieval world, and it's something we've hinted at before, it wasn't exactly overflowing with consumer protections. There wasn't a better business bureau to complain to if your loaf of bread was rock hard or suspiciously molded. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, was the name of the game. So Ilara had to be sharp, quick-witted, and a bit, well, let's say persuasive. Her day often starts with the most basic negotiation, finding food. Now, she might try her luck at the market, but that requires having something to trade. Maybe a trinket, gifted by a generous patron, or a favor she can call in. Perhaps she assisted another woman with some small task. Imagine her approaching a baker. The smell of fresh bread hangs heavy in the air, a cruel temptation when your stomach's rumbling. She might offer him a small coin, barely enough to cover the cost of the flour, let alone his labor. He'll likely scoff. That wouldn't buy you the crust, girl. He'd probably say, maybe with a bit of a sneer. So Ilara has to get creative. Maybe she offers to sweep his shop, fetch water from the well, or run errands for him. Labor in exchange for sustenance. Or perhaps she's overheard some gossip, some bit of news about a rival baker, something the man might find useful. Information, after all, is currency in its own right. She might even try to appeal to his softer side, play on his sympathy, perhaps. Please, sir, she might say, lowering her gaze. I haven't eaten in a day, just a small loaf, enough to keep me going. It's a risk, of course. Some men will take advantage of her vulnerability. Others might see her plight, and out of the goodness of their hearts, offer a kindness. Medieval society wasn't entirely devoid of compassion. But food isn't the only thing Ilara needs to bargain for. There's shelter too. A small corner in a crowded room, perhaps, shared with other women. Rent is due, and the landlady isn't known for her patience. Ilara might offer her services, mending clothes, cleaning, maybe even, well, you can imagine. Then there's the matter of protection. Life on the streets wasn't safe. There were thieves, thugs, and worse. Ilara needed to find someone, usually a burly tavern owner or a slightly less thuggish member of the city watch, to look out for her, to keep her safe from the worst elements. This, of course, came at a price. A percentage of her earnings, a promise of favors, or even, well, let's just say Ilara had to be very careful about who she allied herself with. Protection could quickly turn into exploitation, a delicate balance, walking that tightrope. And it wasn't just about individuals. Sometimes Alara had to negotiate with entire groups. The city guilds, for example, held considerable power. They controlled the flow of goods, the prices of commodities, and even access to certain areas of the city. Alara might need to deal with the Tanners Guild to get leather scraps for repairs, or the Weavers Guild for discarded fabric to patch her clothes. Again, favors, information, and perhaps a touch of charm were her tools. Now you might be thinking, this all sounds rather unfair. And you wouldn't be wrong. Medieval society was hardly a paragon of equality, but Alara wasn't looking for fairness. She was looking for survival, and survival in that world meant understanding the rules of the game and playing them to her advantage. It meant knowing when to be assertive, when to be submissive, when to be charming, and when to be, well, let's just say economical with the truth. It meant understanding the motivations of others, their desires, their fears, and their weaknesses. And it meant never forgetting that in a cutthroat world, every transaction was a battle, and every victory, no matter how small, was a step towards another day. A day with bread. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit more than just bread. Perhaps a bit of cheese, or a piece of fruit, a small luxury that made all the bargaining worthwhile. So, as Alara steps out into the bustling city streets, remember that she's not just a woman trying to make a living. She's a negotiator, a strategist, a survivor. And her ability to bargain, to wheel and deal, to scrape and save, is what keeps her alive. It's her skill, her trade, her art. The art of staying afloat in a world that often seems determined to pull her under. The morning light, what little of it manages to squeeze through the grimy windows of the tavern, finds Alara already awake. She pulls the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, a futile attempt to ward off the persistent chill that seems to seep from the very stones of the building. This isn't home, not even close, but it's a roof of sorts, and right now it's the space between sleep and the waking world. She takes a slow, deep breath, the stale air heavy, with the mingled scents of ale, wood smoke, and something indefinably rank. Time to face the day. The tavern itself is still mostly quiet, the remnants of last night's revelry scattered like fallen leaves after a storm. A few figures are slumped over tables, snoring softly, nursing hangovers they can ill afford. These are the stragglers, the ones who lingered too long, spent too much, and now face a bleary-eyed morning, reckoning with their choices. Alara carefully avoids their gaze, knowing that even a fleeting glance can be misconstrued, lead to unwanted attention. Her own room is little more than a partitioned-off alcove near the back of the main room. Privacy is a luxury she rarely experiences, and the thin wooden panels offer little in the way of soundproofing. She can hear the innkeeper, a stout woman named Agnes, with a face like weathered leather, already bustling about in the kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans, a discordant symphony that signals the start of the day. Agnes tolerates Alara, mostly. She provides a modicum of protection, a place to sleep that's marginally safer than the streets. In return, Alara cleans, serves drinks, and generally keeps out of Agnes' way. It's a precarious arrangement, dependent on Agnes' whims and the steady flow of coin through the tavern. Alara dresses quickly, pulling on the same worn clothes she wore yesterday and the day before that. Hygiene is a constant battle, a losing one most days. Water is scarce, and the communal wash basin is rarely clean. She splashes some water on her face, running her fingers through her tangled hair, trying to tame it into some semblance of order. She knows her appearance matters, that it's part of the bargain she makes every day. As she emerges from her alcove, the tavern is beginning to stir. A few early risers are already nursing mugs of ale, their faces etched with weariness and the burdens of their lives. These are mostly laborers, heading to the docks or the workshops, seeking a brief respite before the day's toil begins. She notices a group of soldiers, their armor glinting dully in the dim light. They're boisterous and rough around the edges, fresh from guard duty or perhaps heading out on patrol. These are dangerous men, accustomed to command and prone to violence. Alara makes a conscious effort to avoid their table, knowing that a wrong word, a perceived slight, could have dire consequences. Soldiers often feel entitled, taking what they want without regard for the consequences. Agnes catches her eye and gestures towards the empty tankards and overflowing ashtrays. Time to earn her keep. Alara sets about clearing the tables, her movements practiced and efficient. She avoids making eye contact, her gaze fixed on the task at hand. She knows the power of silence, the way it can deflect unwanted attention. As she works, she listens, her ears attuned to the undercurrents of conversation that flow through the tavern. Rumors, gossip, snippets of information that could be valuable. Knowledge is a form of currency in this world, and Alara is always looking for ways to increase her holdings. She hears whispers of unrest in the city, murmurings about taxes and the perceived corruption of the city guard. There's a growing discontent in the air, a sense that something is about to break. Alara keeps these rumors close, tucking them away for future consideration. She doesn't know what she'll do with them, but she knows that information can be power. A man approaches her, his eyes lingering a moment too long. He's a merchant, judging by his fine clothes and the heavy rings on his fingers. He smells of spices and wealth, a potent combination that can be both alluring and repellent. "Good morning, girl," he says, his voice oily and ingratiating. "A pretty face like yours shouldn't be wasted on clearing tables." Alara forces a smile, a practiced expression that doesn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, sir. I'm just helping Agnes." "Helping, are you?" He chuckles, a sound that makes her skin crawl. "I'm sure there are other ways you could be helping, ways that would be far more rewarding." She knows what he wants, what he's implying. It's a dance she's danced many times before. She needs to tread carefully, to avoid offending him without encouraging his advances. "Agnes keeps me busy," she says, her voice low and even, "and I wouldn't want to disappoint her." He raises an eyebrow, his gaze speculative. "Perhaps we could discuss other arrangements later, when Agnes isn't looking." Alara feels a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This man is persistent, and he has the means to make her life very difficult. She needs to find a way to extricate herself from this situation without making an enemy. "I'm afraid I'm not available," she says, her voice firm but polite. "I have obligations." He doesn't seem convinced, but he doesn't press the issue. He throws a coin on the table, a meager tip, and turns away, his eyes lingering on her as he walks. Alara lets out a breath. She didn't realize she was holding. That was too close. She needs to be careful, to watch her step. This world is full of dangers, both seen and unseen. As she continues her work, she notices a figure lurking in the shadows near the entrance to the tavern. He's a rough-looking man, his face scarred and weathered, his clothes ragged and worn. He's out of place amidst the wealthier clientele, giving the impression of someone who knows how to handle himself in a street fight. He seems to be watching her. Alara doesn't recognize him, but she feels a sense of unease. Is he a threat? Is he here for her? She tries to ignore him, to focus on her work, but she can't shake the feeling that she's being watched. She finishes clearing the tables and heads towards the kitchen, seeking refuge in the relative safety of Agnes's presence. As she walks, she glances back towards the entrance, but the man is gone. Alara shivers, despite the heat from the kitchen fire. The morning has barely begun, and already she's navigated a gauntlet of potential dangers. This is her life, a constant balancing act between survival and exploitation. She doesn't know what the day will bring, but she knows that she needs to be ready for anything. She hopes to survive until night falls. Maybe then she can get a few hours of sleep, but probably she will not. And now, if you will, let's just gently shift our focus away from the dust, the bartering, the constant alertness. Let's imagine Alara finds a moment, a stolen sliver of peace in a day that seems determined to offer none. perhaps she slips away from the crowded market square, the cacophony of merchants hawking their wares fading behind her like a receding tide. Maybe she seeks refuge in the small, unkempt city garden, a patch of green stubbornly clinging to life amidst the stone and grime. It wouldn't be grand, not a manicured space for noble leisure, but a haphazard collection of herbs, vegetables, and the occasional brave flower, all vying for sunlight and sustenance. Or perhaps she finds herself drawn to the city square, oddly enough. Not for the commerce, but for the spectacle. Sometimes a traveling troupe of players will arrive, their brightly colored costumes a stark contrast to the drab clothing of the townsfolk. She wouldn't be able to afford the best seats, of course, and the jostling crowd would be a pickpocket's paradise, but she could stand at the back, catching snippets of the play, the exaggerated gestures and booming voices momentarily transporting her to another world. Wherever she finds her respite, the change is palpable. The tense set of her shoulders begins to ease. The sharp alertness in her eyes softens just a fraction. It's a temporary reprieve, a borrowed breath, but it's enough. The air, even in the city, might carry the faint scent of earth and growing things, a welcome contrast to the ever-present odor of unwashed bodies and decaying waste. A gentle breeze might stir, carrying with it the distant sound of birdsong, a reminder that life continues beyond the confines of the city walls. What thoughts might drift through her mind in these precious moments? Perhaps a fleeting memory of her childhood, a time before the harsh realities of survival had etched themselves onto her soul, a memory of her mother's garden, filled with fragrant herbs and colorful blooms, a stark contrast to the utilitarian patch she sees before her now. Did she have dreams back then? Aspirations beyond mere survival? Perhaps she allows herself to imagine a different future. A future where she isn't defined by her profession, where she isn't forced to sell her body for survival. A life where she can choose her own path, where she can find love and companionship without the ever-present threat of exploitation and violence. These dreams, she knows, are fragile things, easily shattered by the harsh realities of her life. But in this moment of respite, she allows herself to indulge in them, to let them flicker like a candle in the darkness. They are a source of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the possibility of a better future remains. She might observe the other people around her, a young mother tending to her child, her face etched with weariness, but her eyes filled with love. An old man sitting on a bench, his gaze fixed on some distant point, lost in memories of his own. Lovers whispering sweet nothings, oblivious to the world around them. Do they judge her? Do they see her as less worthy because of her profession? Perhaps. But in this moment she doesn't care. She is just another person, seeking solace and connection in a world that often feels cold and unforgiving. She might notice the sunlight filtering through the leaves of a tree, casting dappled patterns on the ground, the intricate veins of a leaf, the delicate petals of a flower, the sheer resilience of life in the face of adversity. These small details, often overlooked in the frantic pace of her daily life, take on a new significance in this moment of peace. They are a reminder that beauty and wonder can be found even in the most unlikely of places, that life in all its complexity and fragility is a precious gift. Perhaps she whispers a silent prayer, not to a specific deity or religious figure, but to the universe itself, a plea for strength, for guidance, for a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Or perhaps she simply acknowledges the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance of life and death, the eternal cycle of creation and destruction. Whatever her thoughts, whatever her observations, whatever her prayers, the moment of respite is a balm for her weary soul. It is a reminder that she is more than just a prostitute, more than just a survivor. She is a human being with hopes and dreams, with memories and emotions, with the capacity for love and compassion. And as the shadows begin to lengthen, as the sounds of the city begin to intrude once more, she knows that the respite must come to an end. but she carries the memory of it with her, a small spark of hope that will help her to face the challenges that lie ahead. The stolen moments of peace, no matter how brief or infrequent, are what sustain her, what keep her going in a world that seems determined to break her. They are a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, can find beauty and meaning, can cling to hope, and sometimes that's all it takes to keep moving forward. All right, let's talk about the women, the other women. Alara wasn't alone in this profession, of course, and like any workplace, even one as unique as this, you find a spectrum, you find camaraderie, you find competition, sometimes a messy blend of both. Think about it. They're all in the same boat, aren't they? Tossed about by the same storms, clinging to the same fragile planks for survival. There's a shared understanding, a silent language of knowing glances and weary sighs. They've seen things, these women, things that would curdle milk, and who else can they really talk to about it? Some days the tavern's back room, or a quiet corner of the marketplace, would become a makeshift confessional, a quick exchange of warnings. Watch out for the baker, he drinks too much and gets handsy, or a shared piece of hard-won bread. A stolen moment of genuine connection, maybe a whispered secret about a dream of escape, a small act of kindness that meant the world in a world that offered so little. Alara, being relatively new, often found herself on the receiving end of this quiet generosity. A woman named Bronwyn, older with a face etched with experience, took her under her wing, so to speak. Not in a formal, mentoring way, but more like a weary older sister guiding a younger one through treacherous territory. Bronwyn taught her little tricks, how to spot a liar, how to haggle without losing your temper, how to defend yourself if things got rough. Practical knowledge, passed down like precious heirlooms. But then there was Agnes. Agnes was different. Agnes saw every other woman as a direct threat to her livelihood. She was always vying for the best clients, spreading rumors, undercutting prices. There was a constant simmering tension between them all, a subtle power struggle played out in whispered insults and strategic positioning by the tavern door. Agnes might accidentally spill a drink on Alara's best dress, or spread a rumor that Alara was diseased, knowing full well that a reputation once tarnished was hard to restore. It was brutal, this competition, fueled by desperation and the constant fear of slipping further down the social ladder. The strange thing was, even Agnes, in her own twisted way, was a product of the same system. She was just trying to survive, the only way she knew how, and sometimes even Agnes would crack. Alara remembers one particularly cold night. Agnes shivering despite her layers of ragged clothing, her usual bravado replaced by a hollow-eyed vulnerability. She confessed in a slurred whisper that she'd been saving for years to buy a small plot of land outside the city, a place where she could finally be clean. The dream, so fragile, so desperately clung to, hung in the air between them. Then, just as quickly, the bravado returned, a harsh laugh, a dismissal. "Don't you dare tell anyone," she spat, before disappearing back into the smoky tavern. These relationships, they were complex, you see, not easily defined by simple labels like friend or enemy. They were forged in the crucible of shared experience, tempered by hardship, and fueled by the ever-present need to survive. There were alliances too, transient bonds formed out of necessity. If a client became too violent, the women would band together, a united front of feminine strength against male aggression. A well-placed kick, a sharp elbow, a sudden coordinated distraction. They looked out for each other, in their own way, because they knew that no one else would. And then there were the shared stories. Tales of past lives, of lost loves, of dreams abandoned, whispered accounts of families left behind, of betrayals and heartbreaks. Each woman carried a burden of sorrow, a hidden history etched onto her face. These stories, shared in hushed tones, created a sense of solidarity, a recognition that they were more than just the sum of their current circumstances. Alara learned a lot from these women. She learned about resilience, about the strength that could be found in shared vulnerability, about the complexities of human nature. She learned that even in the darkest corners of society, kindness and compassion could still bloom. And she learned that sometimes the fiercest competition masked a deep-seated fear and a desperate longing for something more. It wasn't a pretty picture, this network of women. It was messy, it was flawed, it was often brutal. But it was real, and it was a vital part of Alara's existence. These were the women who understood her world, who shared her struggles, who offered a glimmer of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. And in that shared understanding, in that fragile web of connection, there was a kind of strength. A strength that helped them all to survive, one day at a time. It was what helped her to see there was more than just the next transaction. There was an unseen community always present. A sisterhood made of secrets. Right then, let's see where we can find some coin to ease the burden, shall we? Alara, like many women in her position, understood the delicate dance of assets. Unlike a merchant with goods or a lord with land, her capital was well complicated. It wasn't something she could easily declare or bequeath. It was ephemeral, tied to her youth, her health, and the fleeting desires of others. And those things, they dwindled. Youth faded, illness struck, and favor was a fickle thing. So she learned to accumulate small, tangible treasures, trinkets mostly, gifts from past encounters, moments of fleeting generosity disguised as adornment, a silver thimble from a traveling tailor, charmed by her needlework, a skill she rarely practiced now, truth be told, a chipped amber bead given by a lovesick apprentice, a small tarnished mirror, reflecting a face that seemed to age a little more with each passing day. These weren't objects of great value, not to the wealthy, but to Alara, they represented potential, a meal, a night's lodging, a moment's respite from the relentless pressures of her life. And when times were truly lean, the pawnbroker was her reluctant port of call. Now, the pawnbroker, a figure shrouded in shadows and suspicion in the medieval city. Part merchant, part moneylender, part something else entirely. He was a man who dealt in desperation, who profited from misfortune. His shop, invariably tucked away in a dark alley, smelled of dust, stale ink, and the faint metallic tang of old coins. Entering the pawnbroker's shop was an act of surrender, an admission of vulnerability. The air inside hung thick and heavy, laden with the unspoken stories of countless others who had stood in that very spot, offering up their meager possessions in exchange for survival. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with a chaotic jumble of objects, rusty tools, tarnished silverware, worn clothing, religious icons, each item a silent testament to someone's hardship. The pawnbroker himself, a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to absorb the light, would greet her with a practiced neutrality. No judgment, no pity, just a cold, assessing gaze that stripped away any pretense of value. He knew her trade, of course. He knew most of the city's secrets, whispered and bartered in his shadowy den. The bargaining began. Alara would present her chosen trinket, holding it out in her palm, trying to imbue it with a value it likely didn't possess. This thimble, she might say, her voice a little too bright, is pure silver from a master tailor, worth a good few pennies, surely. The pawnbroker would take the item, turning it over in his fingers, his expression unchanging. He'd test the metal, examine it for flaws, his silence more unnerving than any harsh words. Then, he'd offer his price, a pittance usually, a fraction of what the item might truly be worth. 1 penny, he'd rasp, his voice like dry leaves rustling. Perhaps 2, if I'm feeling generous. The negotiation was a delicate dance of desperation and defiance. Alara would argue, plead, exaggerate. 2 pennies, surely you jest. This is silver, I tell you, and the craftsmanship is exquisite. The pawnbroker would remain unmoved, his eyes fixed on her, gauging her need. He knew she wouldn't walk away. He held the power in this transaction, the power of knowing she had nowhere else to turn. But Alara was no fool. She knew the game. She knew the pawnbroker wouldn't offer a fair price. But she also knew that a penny or two was better than nothing. And sometimes that was all that stood between her and starvation. So she'd haggle, wear him down with her persistence, trying to squeeze an extra farthing from him. She might offer him a small service in return, a bit of gossip she'd overheard in the tavern, a whispered secret that might be of value to him. Information was currency too. In this world, eventually a deal would be struck, a meager sum exchanged for a piece of her past. It was never a satisfying transaction, always leaving her with a gnawing sense of loss. But it was survival. It was a way to keep going, to face another day. Sometimes, though, the price wasn't just coin. Sometimes the pawnbroker wanted something more, a favor, a piece of information he couldn't obtain through other means, a service that required her unique skills and connections. These requests were always veiled, couched in euphemisms and suggestive glances. The pawnbroker knew he couldn't be too overt, not with the city guard patrolling the streets. But the implication was clear, and Alara, weary and worn, understood. To refuse meant walking away empty-handed, facing the uncertainty of another day. To accept meant, well, it meant compromising herself further, adding another layer of grime to her already tarnished soul. These were the moments that tested her, that chipped away at her spirit. The moments when the weight of her choices threatened to crush her. But she was a survivor. She had learned to navigate these treacherous waters, to weigh the cost and make the best decision she could, given the limited options available to her. Sometimes she refused. Sometimes she walked away, even if it meant going hungry. There were lines she wouldn't cross, boundaries she wouldn't breach. Her dignity, her sense of self, was worth more than a few pennies or a fleeting moment of comfort. But sometimes she agreed. Sometimes the need was too great, the desperation too overwhelming, and she would steel herself, push down the guilt and shame, and do what was necessary to survive. The pawnbroker's price was never just about coin. It was about power, about exploitation, about the erosion of the soul. And Alara, like so many women in her position, was forced to pay that price again and again just to keep breathing. As Alara navigates the cobbled streets, the stench of the city clinging to her like a second skin, she's not just breathing in refuse, she's breathing in rumors, whispers carried on the wind, snatches of conversations overheard in taverns, the hushed tones of neighbors leaning over fences. They all paint a picture of discontent simmering beneath the surface of the city. It's a discontent fueled by the usual suspects, of course. High taxes levied by a distant and uncaring lord, the constant threat of disease that seems to disproportionately target the poor, the casual cruelty of those in power, who seem to view the common folk as little more than beasts of burden. But lately, the murmurs have taken on a sharper edge. There's talk of organization, of resistance, of change. Now, Alara isn't a political animal, not in the traditional sense. Her concerns are more immediate, where her next meal is coming from, how to avoid the unwelcome attentions of certain guards, the best price to haggle for a loaf of bread. But she has ears, and she has a certain sympathy for the underdog, perhaps born of her own precarious position. The rumors speak of a clandestine group, their meetings held in secret cellars and abandoned warehouses, their faces obscured by shadows and cloaks. They call themselves, well, the names change depending on who's doing the whispering. The People's Hand, some say. Others murmur of the Silent Brotherhood. Still others claim it's simply the Awakened. Whatever their name, their aim is the same: to challenge the established order, to demand a fairer share, to wrest control from the grasping hands of the elite. These whispers have become more insistent, more frequent. Alara can feel it in the air, a tension that hums beneath the city's usual cacophony of noise and smells. It's a nervous anticipation, a feeling that something is about to shift, And here's where Alara's story becomes a little more interesting. Because it's not just that she hears these rumors, it's that she, perhaps unwittingly, finds herself on the periphery of the burgeoning resistance. She's not a leader, not a strategist, not a firebrand. She's Alara, a woman who sells her time and her body for survival. But she has certain skills. She's observant, she's discreet, and she has access to information that others might not. Think about it. She spends her days and nights in the company of a wide variety of people. Merchants, soldiers, nobles, common laborers. They confide in her, sometimes because they're drunk, sometimes because they're lonely, sometimes because they simply see her as someone beneath their notice, someone who won't repeat what they say. And so, Alara becomes a repository of secrets. She hears gossip about troop movements, whispers about financial irregularities, complaints about the Lord's latest decree, fragments of information that, on their own, might seem insignificant. But pieced together, they can form a mosaic, a revealing picture of the city's inner workings. Now, this information isn't consciously gathered, not at first. She doesn't set out to be a spy or an informant. It's more organic than that. She simply listens, absorbs, and remembers. It's a survival mechanism, a way of understanding the shifting currents of the city, of anticipating potential dangers and opportunities. But then she meets him, or rather she reconnects with him, a childhood acquaintance, a boy she used to play with in the streets, a boy who has now grown into a man with a burning fire in his eyes, and a quiet determination in his voice. His name is Thomas, and he's involved, deeply involved. He doesn't explicitly tell her what he's doing, not at first, but she sees the furtive glances, the hushed conversations, the late-night meetings in dimly lit alleyways, and she pieces it together. He starts asking her questions, subtle questions at first, about her clients, about what they say, about what she sees. He claims it's simply curiosity, a way of catching up on the lives of the city's inhabitants. But she knows better. He's fishing for information. And here's where Alara faces a choice. Does she cooperate? Does she share what she knows? Does she risk her own safety, her own precarious existence, for a cause she doesn't fully understand? There's no grand moral dilemma here, no dramatic internal struggle, just a quiet calculation, a weighing of risks and rewards. On the one hand, there's the very real danger of getting caught, of being branded a traitor, of facing the Lord's wrath. On the other hand, there's the possibility, however remote, of a better future, a future where the scales are balanced, where the poor aren't ground under the heels of the rich, where even a woman like Alara might have a chance at, well, at something more. And there's Thomas. She remembers him as a kind boy, a loyal friend, and she sees in him now a man of conviction, a man who believes in something bigger than himself. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wants to believe in it too. So she starts to share, cautiously, selectively, but she shares. A tidbit of information about a corrupt tax collector, a rumor about a planned shipment of weapons, a warning about an impending crackdown by the city guard. She doesn't become a full-fledged member of the resistance, not yet. She remains on the periphery, a silent observer, a discreet provider of information. But she's involved now, however tangentially. She's part of the undercurrent, part of the descent, part of the potential. And as she walks the streets, she listens more intently, observes more closely. The city's whispers are no longer just background noise. They're clues, they're warnings, they're opportunities. And Alara, the woman who sells her time for survival, finds herself caught in the currents of something far larger than herself. Something that could change the very fabric of the city, or destroy her in the process. The dust swirled around Alara's worn sandals as she navigated the marketplace. The smells, usually a comfort, were today a cacophony. Roasting meats, pungent spices, the ever-present undercurrent of unwashed bodies. She was on the hunt for a slightly less bruised apple, a small luxury in a life defined by necessities. But her usual focused gaze snagged on something, or rather someone, that made her pause. Across the crowded square, near a stall laden with brightly dyed fabrics, stood a woman who seemed to belong to a different world. Her gown, a deep sapphire blue, was of a quality Alara had only ever seen in passing glimpses through the windows of noble houses. The fabric rippled with a subtle sheen, and the embroidery, delicate silver threads forming patterns of stylized flowers, spoke of hours of painstaking work. It was a far cry from the rough-spun woolens and patched linens that comprised Alara's wardrobe, and indeed, that of almost everyone else in the marketplace. But it wasn't just the gown, it was the woman's bearing. She stood tall, her chin lifted slightly, surveying the scene with an air of detached observation. Her hands, pale and slender, were clasped loosely in front of her, adorned with a single modestly sized ring. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, a sense of inherent authority that separated her from the jostling crowd. A noble woman, undoubtedly. Alara knew she should look away. Interactions between those of her station and those of the nobility were rarely pleasant. At best, they were marked by indifference. At worst, by disdain or even outright cruelty. The class divisions in medieval society were stark, rigid lines drawn in the sand, and crossing them could have consequences. And yet, Alara couldn't help but watch. The noble woman turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the marketplace, and then, inexplicably, her eyes met Alara's. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. Alara felt a jolt of surprise, a sense of being seen, truly seen, by someone so far removed from her own reality. The noble woman's expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. But there was something else there, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even pity. It was gone so quickly. Alara wasn't sure if she had imagined it. Then the noble woman gave the barest nod, a subtle acknowledgement of Alara's presence, before turning her attention back to the fabrics. The moment was over. Alara's mind raced. Why had she acknowledged her? It wasn't unheard of for noble women to visit the marketplace. Of course, they needed fabrics, spices, and other goods just like everyone else, but they usually kept themselves aloof, surrounded by servants, their faces carefully shielded from the gaze of the commoners. They certainly didn't make eye contact, let alone offer a nod of acknowledgement. Could she be recognized? Did Alara vaguely resemble someone from the noble woman's past, perhaps a former servant or distant relative? Or had the noble woman possibly heard whispers about Alara, about her profession? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Exposure could bring not only shame, but also danger. Alara knew that many held a cynical view of noble women, casting them as frivolous and uncaring, and she also knew that there were those, particularly among the religious orders, who saw all women like herself as inherently sinful. But Alara wasn't as quick to pass judgment. She had seen kindness in unexpected places, even from those who might have had every reason to look down on her. She had witnessed a range of human behaviors, from the brutally uncaring to the unexpectedly charitable. The problem was, she couldn't be sure how this encounter should be read. There were of course cruel, noble women. Women who would use their power to destroy a life for amusement, for revenge, or to make a point. They used their station to do whatever they pleased. But perhaps this woman was different. Maybe she wanted to help. Though Alara couldn't imagine how that would be possible. More likely, she reflected, it was a simple act of acknowledgement, a fleeting moment of human connection in a world defined by rigid social hierarchies. Perhaps the noble woman, despite her privileged position, felt a pang of empathy, a brief recognition of the shared humanity that bound them together, despite their vastly different lives. And yet, Alara knew that even such a small act could have unintended consequences. The social fabric of the medieval world was a delicate thing, woven with threads of tradition, obligation, and power. Any disruption, no matter how small, could send ripples through the entire system. For someone like Alara who lived on the margins, those ripples could be devastating. Alara thought about her own existence. The constant negotiations for survival, the ever-present threat of violence, the constant need to protect herself. It was a hard life. a life of constant uncertainty, but it was her life, and she was determined to protect it. This was her means to subsist. The woman's station was a symbol of the social divide. The woman had probably never known hardship, at least not the kind Alara faced every day. It was difficult to connect to someone whose entire life was almost certainly the opposite of her own. Alara forced herself to move, to continue her search for the apple. The marketplace was as busy as ever, the voices and smells swirling around her. But the encounter with the noblewoman had left her unsettled, a lingering question mark hanging in the air. Lady or liar, a question only time would reveal. For now, all Alara could do was continue to navigate the complexities of her world, to protect herself as best she could, and to hope that the ripple caused by that brief encounter would eventually fade away, leaving her life undisturbed. All right, settle back in, friends. We've made it through the morning rush, dodged a few unsavory characters, and maybe even managed a stolen nap. But the day is far from over, isn't it? The afternoon brings a different kind of clientele, a different energy to the tavern, and a whole new set of, well, let's just say opportunities for Alara. So let's imagine Alara is in her tiny room, a space barely big enough to turn around in. It's baking under the afternoon sun, the air thick and stagnant. Time for a bit of a spruce up, you see. First things first, a splash of water to the face. Cold water from the ewer, if there is any left. Anyway, it's not exactly a refreshing bath, but it's enough to chase away the last vestiges of sleep, and maybe mask the less than pleasant odors of the day so far. Remember, hygiene is a battle. Alara is constantly losing, but she fights it nonetheless. Next, a quick assessment of her, assets. A critical eye in the cracked mirror. A bit of rouge here, a smudge of kohl there. The goal isn't exactly beauty, mind you, more like availability. The look needs to be inviting, suggestive, but never too desperate. Desperation is bad for business. It lowers the price. And speaking of price, a mental review is needed. What's the going rate for an afternoon chat? A bit of light company. The price depends on the customer, of course, and on Alara's mood. A grumpy merchant might get a higher price, while a lonely soldier might get a little wiggle room. Flexibility is key in this business, but so is knowing your worth. Now, about the outfit. The morning's attire is likely still presentable. Perhaps a quick brush down to remove any lingering stains from breakfast or overeager patrons. A strategically placed flower, maybe tucked into the bodice for a touch of freshness. The clothing itself is simple, practical. Nothing too fancy, nothing too revealing. Again, it's about suggestion, not outright advertising. Layers are important. They allow for a certain gradual unveiling, which can be part of the allure, and then the mental prep. This is perhaps the most crucial part of the afternoon routine. Alara needs to steel herself, to put on her game face. It's not just about physical appearance, it's about attitude, about projecting an air of confidence, even if that confidence is paper thin. She needs to be ready to deal with a variety of personalities, from the boisterous and handsy to the shy and awkward. Each customer requires a different approach, a different performance. The afternoon clientele is often a mixed bag. You have merchants looking for a midday escape from the tedium of trade. They might be looking for a bit of gossip, a bit of flattery, perhaps even a bit of business advice. Then there are the apprentices and journeymen, young men with a bit of coin burning a hole in their pockets, eager to experience the pleasures of adulthood. They might be inexperienced, nervous, and require a bit of gentle guidance. And of course there are the soldiers, always the soldiers. Lonely, restless, far from home. They might be looking for comfort, for companionship, or simply for a release from the stresses of military life. Dealing with soldiers requires a certain toughness, a certain ability to deflect unwanted advances. Each of these encounters can be unpredictable. Some customers are pleasant, even generous. Others are demanding, rude, or even downright dangerous. Alara has to be able to assess each situation quickly, to gauge the customer's mood and intentions, and to adapt her behavior accordingly. It's a delicate dance, a constant negotiation, it's a performance. The aim is to make each customer feel valued, even if only for a few minutes. Because a happy customer is a repeat customer, and repeat customers are essential for survival. But it's not just about pleasing the customers, you see. It's also about protecting herself. Alara needs to be aware of her surroundings, to be vigilant for signs of trouble. A drunken brawl, a heated argument, a lurking figure in the shadows, these are all potential threats. She needs to know who to trust and who to avoid, and she needs to be ready to defend herself if necessary. A sharp word, a quick shove, or even a well-aimed kick can be enough to deter a would-be assailant. The afternoon shift can be long and grueling. Hours spent smiling, flattering, and entertaining. The constant pressure to be on, to be engaging, to be desirable. It can be exhausting, both physically and emotionally. But Alara perseveres, driven by the need to survive, to earn enough coin to pay her rent, to buy her food, to keep herself alive in this harsh and unforgiving world. It's a tough life, friends, a hard life. But it's her life, and she will face it head-on, with whatever strength and cunning she can muster. And so, with a deep breath, a final glance in the cracked mirror, and a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, Alara steps back into the tavern, ready to face whatever the afternoon may bring. Alara's morning had been, well, Alara's morning. The usual dance of survival, in a city that cared little for her well-being. But the afternoon held a different kind of weight, a different kind of demand. The tavern was darker now, the air thick with the stale scent of ale and sweat. A merchant, portly and red-faced, sat alone in a shadowed corner, nursing a tankard. He'd been there for a while, nursing that drink like it was the last coin in his purse. He wasn't the usual sort, the kind who sought fleeting pleasure and left coin in exchange. There was a sorrow about him, a weariness that seemed to seep from his very pores. He wasn't leering, wasn't making crude jokes with the other men. He just sat, a mountain of a man slumped under the weight of something unseen. Alara approached cautiously. Years in this life had taught her to read faces, to discern the unspoken needs that lurked beneath the surface. This merchant, he needed something more than just a warm body, he needed an ear. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice soft, a deliberate contrast to the tavern's din. "May I join you?" He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, the corners crinkled with a permanent sadness. He nodded slowly, gesturing to the empty stool. "Please," he mumbled, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. She sat, maintaining a respectful distance. No immediate offers of intimacy, no suggestive glances, just quiet companionship. "A hard day," she ventured, the question simple, open-ended. He sighed, a sound like air escaping a bellows. "Hard days, hard weeks, hard years, girl. They all bleed together." Alara waited, patient. She'd learned the value of silence, the way it could coax out words that would otherwise remain hidden. "My business," he finally said, swirling the ale in his tankard. "It's failing. The taxes, the thieving guilds, the competition, it's all too much. I barely make enough to feed my family anymore." Alara nodded, understanding dawning. It wasn't lust that brought him here, but desperation. He wasn't looking for a release, but a release valve. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," she said, her voice sincere. "Times are hard for many." "Hard? It's crushing," he replied, his voice rising slightly, then quickly falling back to a whisper. "I used to be respected, a man of means. Now I'm just a shadow of myself, watching everything I've built crumble around me." He looked at her then, a pleading look in his eyes. "My wife, she doesn't understand. She thinks I'm just failing. She nags, she complains, she doesn't see the burden I carry." Alara's heart softened. She knew that look, that sense of isolation. It was the same look she saw in the mirror every morning. "Sometimes," she said quietly, It's easier to share a burden with someone who doesn't judge, someone who just listens. He stared at her, his eyes searching. You understand. I understand what it's like to carry a weight, she replied, her gaze steady. Different weight, perhaps, but a weight nonetheless. He took a long drink of his ale, the silence stretching between them. Then he began to talk. He spoke of his father, a master craftsman who'd taught him everything he knew. He spoke of his dreams, of building a thriving business that would provide for his family for generations. He spoke of the setbacks, the betrayals, the crushing weight of responsibility. Alara listened, truly listened. She didn't offer platitudes, didn't offer solutions. She simply absorbed his pain, offering a safe space for him to vent his frustrations. She nodded at the right moments, made small sounds of sympathy, and occasionally asked gentle, probing questions. She learned about his wife, a woman who'd once been his greatest champion, now worn down by hardship and fear. He spoke of his children, their bright faces and innocent expectations, the very reason he struggled so fiercely. He talked for hours, the tavern slowly emptying around them. The other patrons, sensing the solemnity of the encounter, gave them a wide berth. The tavern keeper, a gruff but not unkind man, kept their tankards filled, understanding the need for a sympathetic ear. As the night deepened, the merchant's voice grew softer, his shoulders less slumped. The weight hadn't vanished, but it seemed lighter, somehow. Finally, he fell silent, his gaze lost in the flickering candlelight. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I haven't felt this relieved in years." Alara smiled gently. "You're welcome, sir." He reached into his purse, pulling out a handful of coins. He placed them in her hand, far more than she would normally receive for a simple conversation. "For your time," he said, "and for listening." She closed her fingers around the coins, her heart aching with a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. It wasn't the money she valued, but the connection, the brief fleeting moment of shared humanity in a world that often felt devoid of it. "I hope things get better for you, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. Perhaps they will. "Thank you, Alara." He knew her name. He rose, his movements slow but steadier than before. He gave her a small, grateful bow, then turned and walked out of the tavern, disappearing into the night. Alara watched him go, the weight of his sadness settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just selling pleasure, she was selling solace. She was a confidant, a sounding board, a temporary escape from the crushing realities of life. It was emotional labor, draining and often unacknowledged. She knew that his problems wouldn't magically disappear. She knew that his struggles would continue. But perhaps, just perhaps, she'd given him the strength to face another day. And in this life, in this city, that was sometimes the best one could hope for. She sighed and tucked the coins away. It was time to face the night again, and the needs it brought with it. "All right, settle in, folks, because we're about to talk about something. Well, it's not exciting, but it's definitely important. We're talking about money, specifically how our medieval prostitute Alara manages it." It's easy to think of a profession like Alara's as simply a transaction service rendered, coin received, but in reality, it's a complicated financial tightrope walk. Let's get into it, shall we? First, there's the obvious: income. A single encounter could bring in anywhere from a meager denier, barely enough for a loaf of stale bread, to a more respectable gross tournure. The actual sum depended on a lot of things. Alara's appearance, her perceived skills, or at least what she convinces her clients were her skills, the man's wealth, his level of intoxication, and the general economic climate all played a role. If the harvest was bad, or the city was at war, men tended to be less generous. Simple as that really, but very impactful on whether you could feed yourself or not. But it's not a simple question of maximizing profit. Alara, like any medieval worker, isn't getting the full value of her labor. Think of it like the Middle Ages, where an employer simply takes their cut before you, as the employee, see any money. In Alara's case, this means she likely owes a portion of her earnings to someone, perhaps a brothel madam, if she's working in an establishment, or maybe a local gang leader who offers protection from, well, other gangs and unsavory characters. If she refused, things could get messy. This protection is basically just a fancy name for extortion, a way for stronger and more frightening people to simply take money for doing nothing. This cut could be a significant chunk of her income, sometimes as much as half, which means she's already starting in the negative. Alara isn't just trying to earn a living, she's trying to earn a living after paying off her business expenses, if you will. If you want to think of it in those terms. Then there are the day-to-day costs of survival. Food, of course, even the cheapest bread and watered-down ale add up. Clothing is another expense. Alara needs to maintain a certain image to attract customers. Rags won't do. This can be tough, as she needs something that looks appealing but is still affordable on her income. And then there's rent. If Alara has a room, even a small cramped one, she has to pay for it. This could be a daily, weekly, or monthly fee, depending on her arrangement. Shelter is non-negotiable, especially during the cold winter months. It gets cold without proper walls or fire. Medical expenses are also a grim reality. Injuries, illnesses, and the unavoidable consequences of her profession all take their toll. A visit to a barber surgeon, who was basically a medieval general practitioner and could be incredibly dangerous, or a local healer is often necessary. These aren't cheap, and the remedies could be, well, let's just say they weren't always effective. Beyond the basics, there's the constant temptation to spend. A pretty ribbon, a piece of jewelry, a slightly better meal. These things offer a momentary escape from the harshness of her life. But indulging too often can quickly drain her meager savings, making her even more vulnerable. And that's where debt comes in. It's a slippery slope. Alara might borrow money from a pawnbroker, a moneylender, or even another woman in her profession to cover an unexpected expense, or simply to get by during a slow period. The interest rates on these loans are often exorbitant. It's easy to fall into a cycle of debt, where a large chunk of your income just goes to paying down the interest, and very little on the main debt itself. It becomes so very easy to never escape that cycle and be forever in the pocket of a lender. But debt wasn't always a purely negative thing. In some cases, it could be a calculated risk. Maybe Alara borrows money to buy a slightly nicer dress, hoping to attract wealthier clients and increase her earnings. It's a gamble, but sometimes a necessary one, a risk to try to climb the ranks. Then there are the risks inherent in her profession. Theft is a constant threat. Clients might try to cheat her or outright steal her earnings. And if she reports it to the city guard, well, let's just say they aren't always sympathetic. She could face a fine, imprisonment, or worse for simply admitting to her profession. Corruption and the law are very intertwined. Violence is another ever-present danger. Alara could be assaulted by a client, a jealous rival, or simply a random drunk. Protecting herself is difficult. She might carry a small knife, but that's often more for show than actual defense. Relying on her wits and street smarts is often her best bet. Trying to talk her way out of situations or make a sharp exit before things escalate. And then there's the risk of pregnancy. An unplanned pregnancy could be disastrous. It would mean an end to her income, at least temporarily, and the added expense of caring for a child. Abortion was practiced in the Middle Ages, but it was dangerous and often unreliable. Abandonment was another option, but it carried a heavy moral weight and didn't guarantee the child's survival. Despite all these challenges, Alara is not without agency. She makes choices, she negotiates, she schemes, she hustles. She might hide away some coins for a rainy day, or invest in a small item she can sell later. She might cultivate relationships with powerful people who can offer protection or assistance. She might even learn a skill, like sewing or cooking, that could provide her with an alternative source of income. Ultimately, Alara's financial life is a reflection of her precarious existence. She's constantly balancing risk and reward, trying to navigate a system that's stacked against her. But she's not a passive victim, she's a survivor, fighting for every coin and clinging to the hope of a better future. And sometimes, just sometimes, she manages to pull it off. A few coins saved here and there, a small purchase that turns a good profit, or a new skill learnt that helps her escape the profession altogether. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, but it's real. It's the economic engine that keeps Alara going, day after day, in the grim reality of the medieval city. Here we are, in the shadows of the church. It's an unavoidable part of Alara's life, a constant presence, looming large both physically and morally. You see, the medieval church, while often providing solace and guidance, also held immense power, and with power, inevitably came hypocrisy and judgment. Now Alara, much like other women in her profession, wasn't exactly a welcome sight within the hallowed walls of a cathedral. But that didn't mean she never encountered those who served the Lord. Sometimes it was unavoidable. Consider the local friar, Brother Thomas. He was a portly man with a booming laugh and a fondness for the local ale. He preached fiery sermons against the sins of the flesh, railing against lust and temptation with a fervor that often left the congregation feeling rather uncomfortable. Yet on more than one occasion, Alara saw Brother Thomas slipping into the darkened corners of the tavern, the very place where she plied her trade. He would avoid her gaze, of course, pulling his cowl low over his face, but Alara wasn't blind. She knew he was there, seeking, let's just say, seeking solace in the company of women who weren't exactly known for their piety. One particular evening, after a particularly impassioned sermon about the evils of fornication, Alara found herself serving wine to a group of merchants in a dimly lit booth. Suddenly, a shadow fell across her. She looked up and there he was, Brother Thomas, looking rather sheepish. "Alara," he said, his voice hushed. I need to speak with you." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "About what, brother? Perhaps you require absolution?" she asked, a playful smirk dancing on her lips. He flushed crimson. No, nothing like that," he stammered. "It's just, well, I've heard you have a certain understanding of the city's affairs, rumors, secrets, things of that nature." Alara leaned closer, her eyes narrowed. "And what would a man of God want with such things?" He hesitated, then sighed. "There are certain individuals within the church who are not as virtuous as they appear. Men who use their position for personal gain, who exploit the poor and vulnerable. I want to expose them, but I need proof." Alara was taken aback. "This was unexpected, and you think I can help you?" "I know you can," he said, his voice firm. "You see things, Alara. You hear things. People trust you, even if they don't respect you." And so began an unlikely alliance. Alara, the ostracized prostitute, and Brother Thomas, the conflicted friar, working together to expose corruption within the church. She would listen to snippets of conversations, gather whispers of scandal, and pass the information on to him. He in turn would use his position and influence to investigate further. It was a dangerous game. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But they were both driven by a sense of justice, a desire to right the wrongs they saw around them. Of course, not all encounters with religious figures were quite so productive. There were the judgmental glances, the whispered condemnations, the blatant attempts to shame her and other women like her. Alara learned to harden herself against these attacks, to build a wall around her heart. One day, while fetching water from the well, she was approached by a stern-faced nun, Sister Agnes. The nun looked at her with undisguised disgust. "You are a stain on this city," she hissed. "A temptress leading men astray. You should be ashamed of yourself." Alara met her gaze, her chin held high. And what about the men who come to me, sister? Are they not responsible for their own actions? Or is it always the woman who is to blame? Sister Agnes scoffed. They are weak, easily led astray by your wiles. Perhaps, Alara replied calmly. Or perhaps they are simply seeking comfort, companionship, someone to listen to their troubles, something they don't find within the cold stone walls of your convent. The nun's face contorted with rage. You are beyond redemption, she spat, before turning and stomping away. Such encounters were common, a constant reminder of her outcast status. But Alara refused to be defined by the judgment of others. She knew that her work was necessary, that she provided a service, however unsavory, and she knew that, deep down, many of those who condemned her were often secretly envious of the freedom she possessed, a freedom to live outside the rigid confines of medieval society. And then there were the rare moments of genuine compassion. An elderly priest, Father Benedict, who would occasionally offer her a kind word or a small act of charity. He never condoned her profession, but he recognized her humanity, her inherent worth as a human being. One cold winter evening, Father Benedict found Alara huddled in a doorway, shivering with cold. He gently placed a warm loaf of bread in her hands. God loves you, Alara, he said softly, even if others do not. Alara looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, Father, she whispered. Thank you. These small acts of kindness, these fleeting moments of understanding, were like glimmers of light in the darkness, reminding her that even in the shadows of the church, there was still hope, still humanity, still a chance for redemption. They gave her the strength to carry on, to face the hypocrisy and judgment with her head held high, and to continue her unlikely alliance with the conflicted friar, Brother Thomas, in their quest to expose the darkness within the light. They were the reason Alara did what she did. They gave her strength when she had nothing else. And so, as Alara prepared for the evening's trade, a different kind of transaction caught her eye. Not the exchange of coin for comfort, but something far more fundamental. A mother bartering for scraps, for anything to quiet the rumbling bellies of her children. Alara found herself in the heart of the city square, a space usually bustling with commerce and boasting about wealth. But today the air hung heavy, not just with the usual grime and odor, but with a palpable desperation. Around the edges of the square, where the grand merchants' stalls gave way to the worn cobblestones, a different kind of market was unfolding. This was the market of the poor, a silent auction of threadbare clothes, chipped pottery, and weary hope. She saw her, a woman no older than herself, perhaps even younger, her face etched with a premature map of hardship. She clutched two small children to her, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with a kind of hollow hunger that clawed at Alara's insides. The woman was trying to trade a patched-up tunic, its color faded with countless washes, for a handful of stale bread. The baker, a burly man with flour, dusting his apron like snow, scoffed. That rag? It's not worth the crusts under my table. Be gone with you, before you scare away my customers. Alara watched, frozen. It was a scene she'd witnessed countless times, a familiar tableau of callousness in a city overflowing with riches and indifference. But today, it struck her differently. Perhaps it was the mirroring of her own situation, the desperate bargaining for survival in a world that cared little for those at the bottom. Or maybe it was the stark innocence in the children's eyes, a purity that reminded her of something she had lost, something that felt irretrievable now, maybe. The woman, defeated but unbowed, moved on, her small caravan of misery trailing behind her. She approached a vegetable vendor, a wizened old woman with a cart overflowing with cabbages and turnips. The woman offered a small tarnished silver locket, its surface scratched and worn smooth with age. A keepsake, Alara thought, perhaps a memento of a happier time, traded for sustenance. But the vendor, too, shook her head. Silver's worthless these days, girl. Too many trinkets floating around. Find someone daft enough to want it, but don't waste my time. The children whimpered, their tiny hands gripping their mother's skirts. Alara felt a lump form in her throat, a bitter knot of guilt and empathy. She knew that hunger, she knew that humiliation, she knew the gnawing desperation of wanting to provide, to protect, and failing. It was the cry of a child, a high, keening wail that sliced through the hubbub of the square. Not the tantrum of a spoiled brat, but a cry born of genuine pain, of empty stomachs and aching limbs. Alara's own breath hitched in her chest. A memory surfaced, unbidden, unwanted. Herself, younger, smaller, clinging to her own mother's ragged cloak, begging for a crust of bread, a piece of fruit discarded by a wealthy merchant. The shame, the helplessness, the crushing weight of knowing that her hunger was a burden on her mother's already burdened shoulders. The image of that little girl, vulnerable and yearning, was the same girl who'd lost her father to the pestilence, and then her mother not long after, leaving her to fend for herself. She was looking back from across what felt like a great distance to who Alara was now. It wasn't just hunger these children felt, she realized. It was fear. The same fear she had known, that icy dread of the unknown, the terrifying prospect of being alone, forgotten, swallowed whole by the uncaring city. Alara knew she couldn't save them all. The city was teeming with poverty, with desperation, with stories of hardship that would break even the strongest heart. But in that moment, standing there in the bustling square, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility, not the obligation she felt towards her clientele, the carefully calculated performance of pleasure for profit, but a deeper, more fundamental responsibility towards her fellow human beings, towards the vulnerable, the forgotten. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the few coins she had earned that day. Not a fortune, but enough to make a difference, perhaps. Enough to buy a loaf of bread, a handful of apples, a moment of respite from the gnawing hunger. But as she prepared to approach the woman, to offer her meager assistance, she paused. What right did she have? She who peddled her body for survival, who had long ago abandoned any pretense of virtue or innocence, to offer charity. Wouldn't it be seen as mockery, a cruel reminder of her own fallen state? The question hung in the air, heavy with self-doubt. Was she a hypocrite, a liar, a creature of the night, unworthy of compassion? Alara closed her eyes, a silent battle waging within her. The cynicism she had cultivated, the armor she had donned to protect herself from the harsh realities of her life, threatened to suffocate the spark of empathy that had been rekindled by the sight of those hungry children. This was the plight of the poor. It was hard. The image of her mother surfaced again, her face etched with love and weariness, her hands calloused from labor. She had taught Alara kindness, compassion, the importance of helping those less fortunate. Had she betrayed those lessons? Had she become the very thing she had once despised, a self-serving creature, blind to the suffering of others? With a deep breath, Alara banished the doubts, the cynicism, the self-recrimination. Perhaps she was flawed, perhaps she had made choices that had led her down a dark path. But that didn't mean she was incapable of kindness, of compassion, of offering a helping hand. In that small way, maybe she could honor the memory of that little girl clinging to her mother's cloak, that innocent child who had once dreamed of a better world. All right, let's talk about something a little less romantic and a lot more practical. We've skirted around it, but we can't exactly pretend it didn't exist. I'm talking about the city guard and the, shall we say, arrangements that were sometimes necessary to ensure one's continued well-being. After all, even in the Middle Ages, someone had to keep the peace-ish. The city guard, in theory, existed to protect the citizens, enforce the law, and generally maintain order. In reality, well, let's just say that opportunities for graft and corruption were plentiful, especially in the less reputable districts, which is where Alara and many others like her found themselves. Think of it this way. The guards were often poorly paid and life was, well, expensive, especially if you had a family to support or maybe a drinking problem. So, the temptation to supplement their income through a little discretion was often too strong to resist. Now, Elara wasn't exactly running a criminal enterprise. She wasn't robbing merchants or starting brawls, but her profession was, shall we say, frowned upon. Officially, prostitution was often illegal, or at least heavily regulated, but those regulations were rarely enforced with consistent zeal, unless, of course, someone wasn't cooperating. Imagine a guard making his rounds on a particularly damp and dreary evening. He spots Elara plying her trade near the tavern. He could, in theory, arrest her, drag her before the magistrate, where she'd face a fine or perhaps even a few days in the stocks. But that would be inconvenient for everyone. For Elara, obviously, because stocks are not comfortable, but also for the guard. He'd have to fill out paperwork, testify in court. It was all a bit of a hassle. And besides, what good would it do? Another woman would just take her place, and the problem, as the guard might see it, would remain. So, a more pragmatic solution was often reached. A small payment, a contributions to the guard's discretion fund, as it were, in exchange for turning a blind eye, for pretending he didn't see anything, for moving on to the next corner and the next opportunity. The amount varied, of course. Depending on the guard's greed, the time of the month rent was always due, and Elara's own bargaining skills. Sometimes it was a few copper coins, other times it was a silver groat, a significant chunk of her earnings. And it wasn't just the official guards, either. Sometimes less official figures would try their hand at extortion. Thugs, local toughs, claiming to offer protections. From what, exactly? Well, from themselves mostly. But the threat was real enough. A broken window, a stolen purse, a misunderstanding that could quickly escalate. Navigating this world of petty corruption was a constant balancing act. Pay too much, and you're barely scraping by. Pay too little, and you risk attracting unwanted attention, or even violence. Elara had learned a few tricks over the years, knowing which guards were amenable to a friendly arrangement, learning how to politely deflect the demands of the less reputable characters, knowing when to stand her ground, and when to simply pay up and avoid trouble. She also knew that information was valuable. A whispered rumor, a glimpse of a suspicious meeting, a piece of gossip overheard in the tavern. These things could be traded, offered to the right guard, in exchange for a little leniency, a little extra protection, or simply a warning about upcoming raids or crackdowns. And then there was the occasional truly corrupt official, a city alderman perhaps, or a wealthy merchant, using the guards to settle scores or to eliminate rivals. These were the most dangerous, because they had the power to make life truly miserable. Falsified charges, trumped-up accusations, a sudden, unexpected eviction. Dealing with these individuals required a different approach: flattery, subservience, and a willingness to cooperate in whatever way they demanded. It was a degrading, humiliating experience. But sometimes it was the only way to survive. The worst part was the feeling of powerlessness, the knowledge that she was at the mercy of these men, that her livelihood, her safety, even her life, depended on their whims. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, that every woman in her profession faced the same challenges, the same risks, and sometimes there was a small measure of defiance, a muttered insult, a subtle act of sabotage, a quiet refusal to be completely broken, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, a small spark of resistance could still flicker. It wasn't a glamorous life, certainly. It wasn't a life of freedom or independence, but it was a life nonetheless. And Elara, like so many others, was determined to survive it in whatever way she could, even if it meant playing the game, even if it meant paying the price, even if it meant dealing with the guards and their greed. As the hours creep later, the tavern's atmosphere shifts. The boisterous laughter dulls, replaced by a heavier, more oppressive energy. The faces that were flushed with drink and merriment earlier now bear the weight of their own troubles, their desires warped by shadows and desperation. For Alara, this is when the work truly begins. The easy smiles and playful banter of the evening are replaced by a necessary armor. This is the time when the line between transaction and violation becomes dangerously thin. There's Thomas, the blacksmith. He's usually jovial, generous even, but after enough ale, a darkness flickers in his eyes. He demands things he wouldn't dare suggest sober, his grip tightening a little too much, his words slurring into possessive pronouncements. Dealing with Thomas means walking a tightrope, deflecting his advances with carefully chosen words, reminding him, subtly, of the consequences of overstepping. It's a delicate dance of appeasement and control. One wrong step could trigger his ire, or worse. Then there's Old Man Hemlock, the moneylender. A dry husk of a man, he rarely drinks, his eyes cold and calculating. He doesn't seek pleasure in the act itself, but in the power it represents. He uses his coin to buy not just Alara's time, but a sense of dominance, of control over someone else's fate. He lingers, asking questions that feel like veiled threats, probing for vulnerabilities he can exploit. With him, it's a game of keeping him at arm's length, offering just enough to satisfy his ego without revealing anything that could be used against her. And of course, there are the ones who simply can't afford a coin, but try their luck anyway. Beggars, desperate men driven to the edge by poverty and hunger. Turning them away is never easy. Their pleading eyes and hollow faces are a stark reminder of Alara's own precarious existence. Sometimes, she can offer a kind word, a shared crust of bread, but she can't afford to be charitable too often. Survival demands a certain level of self-preservation, but it's not always about fending off unwanted advances or dealing with unpleasant personalities. Sometimes, it's the silence that's most unsettling. The man who stares without speaking, his eyes filled with a nameless sadness. The one who seeks not pleasure, but oblivion, using Alara as a means of escaping the weight of his own despair. These encounters leave a mark, a lingering sense of unease that's harder to shake off than a drunken leer. They speak to a deeper kind of pain, a loneliness that transcends the physical. And Alara, despite her own hardened exterior, can't help but feel a pang of empathy, a recognition of the shared human condition that binds them together, even in this transactional space. The darkest nights are when the violence spills over. A drunken brawl erupts, a knife flashes in the dim light, and suddenly Alara is caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate the chaos and protect herself from harm. She's learned to read the signs, to anticipate the flashpoints, to disappear into the shadows before the situation escalates beyond control. But sometimes, it's unavoidable. A shove, a stray blow, a whispered threat. These are the realities of her profession, the price she pays for survival. The scars, both visible and invisible, accumulate over time. A faded bruise, a lingering ache, a knot of anxiety in the pit of her stomach. They serve as reminders of the dangers she faces, the vulnerability she can never truly escape. But amidst the darkness, there are also moments of unexpected connection. A kind word from a weary traveler, a shared laugh with another woman in the trade, a fleeting glimpse of humanity that pierces through the layers of cynicism. These small moments of grace are what keep her going, the faint embers of hope that flicker in the long, dark night. They remind her that even in this world of transactions and exploitation, there is still room for compassion, for connection, for the possibility of something more. It's a hard life, a brutal life, but it's the only life Alara knows. And as the night wears on, she steels herself, ready to face whatever darkness comes her way, clinging to the hope that tomorrow will be a little brighter, a little kinder, a little less heavy. She knows that's unlikely, but hope is a powerful thing, and Alara needs all the power she can muster to survive another night. The tavern doors creak open again, another silhouette enters the dim light, and she sighs, offering the best smile she can manage. It's time to work. The night wore on, much like any other. The tavern, now thinning of its earlier raucous energy, still hummed with the low thrum of hushed conversations and the clinking of tankards. Alara, feigning a bit of tidying near the back of the common room, was mostly just trying to stay warm and maybe, just maybe, catch a few stolen winks before the last stragglers were ushered out. The chill seeped through the poorly mortared stone walls, a constant reminder of the coming winter's bite. But it wasn't the cold that kept her alert. It was the murmur of voices from a darkened corner booth. Normally, she wouldn't pay any mind. Drunken boasts and whispered sweet nothings were as common as spilled ale in this place. But something about the tone, the urgency barely masked beneath lowered voices, pricked her senses. These weren't the ramblings of men loosened by drink. This was something else, something deliberate, leaning casually against a pillar, pretending to polish it with a rag already gritty with dust. Alara subtly strained to hear. The two men were cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light of a single flickering candle on their table. One was thick-set, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The other was leaner, his voice higher, sharper, like a honed blade. Insufferable peacock, the thick-set man growled, the words laced with venom. Thinks his lineage grants him immunity. He parades around like he owns the city. He almost does, doesn't he? The sharper voice replied, a hint of amusement cutting through the gloom. With the Duke's ear and half the city guard lining his pockets, Lord Beaumont's influence is considerable. Beaumont, a name that carried weight and a hefty price tag if you wanted his attention. Alara knew the man by sight. Arrogant, entitled, and not someone you wanted to cross. But what was this about? Considerable, yes, the thick-set man conceded, but not unbreakable. Everyone has a weakness. Beaumont's is information. He craves it, hoards it like a dragon with gold. Alara's interest peaked. Beaumont and information. That was a combination worth noting. Knowledge was currency in this city, often more valuable than silver. And what information do you propose we offer that he doesn't already possess? The sharper voice questioned, a note of skepticism creeping in. He's a spider at the center of a web, remember. He knows everything that moves within these walls. The thick-set man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He thinks he does, but spiders are easily distracted. This web has a tier, a small one, but big enough for a rat or two to slip through unnoticed. He paused, and Alara held her breath, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words. What tier was he talking about? There's discontent brewing in the lower wards, the thick-set man continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The Duke's taxes are bleeding them dry. They're whispering of resistance. Resistance. Now that was a word that could set the city ablaze. Whispers of rebellion had been circulating for months, fueled by poverty and resentment. But whispers were just whispers, unless they had a flame to ignite them. Resistance. Child's play, the sharper voice scoffed. The guard will crush them like beetles under a boot heel. Perhaps, the thick-set man allowed, but what if someone were to provide the right spark? What if those whispers were organized, guided? Alara's mind raced. Organized resistance. That meant someone was planning something. And if Beaumont knew about it, or, more accurately, if he didn't know about it, you're suggesting. The sharper voice trailed off, the skepticism replaced with a note of calculation. I'm suggesting, the thick-set man said slowly, deliberately, that a well-timed revelation of this organized resistance, along with the names of those fanning the flames, would be highly appreciated by certain influential parties. A shiver ran down Alara's spine, and it wasn't from the cold. The thick-set man wasn't just talking about gaining favor with Beaumont. He was talking about betrayal. He was talking about handing over people to the Duke's justice, which was rarely just. And what would be our reward for such loyalty? The sharper voice inquired, the word loyalty dripping with sarcasm. Let's just say, the thick-set man replied, a predatory gleam in his voice that Alara could almost feel across the room. that Lord Beaumont is generous to those who provide him with valuable insights, enough to set us both up quite comfortably for the foreseeable future. Land perhaps, titles, influence, all within our grasp if we play our cards right. He leaned forward, his voice now barely audible. Think of it, Alaric. No more scraping by in the shadows. We could be someone. Alaric, so that was his name. Another piece of the puzzle. Alara committed it to memory. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken ambition and the promise of power. Then, Alaric spoke, his voice now laced with a newfound eagerness. And how do we acquire this information? The thick-set man chuckled again, a sound that made Alara's stomach churn. That, my friend, is where the fun begins. There are always ears, willing to listen for the right price, loose tongues, eager to boast when plied with enough ale. And then there are women who know more than they let on. Alara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Had he seen her? Had he suspected she was listening? She forced herself to remain still, to continue feigning her mindless polishing. Women, Alaric scoffed. What could a woman possibly know about political intrigue? Don't underestimate them, Alaric, the thick-set man warned, his voice low and dangerous. They see things we miss. They hear things we ignore. They are conduits of information, and sometimes they are surprisingly persuasive. He paused again, the silence even more unsettling than before. Alara could feel his eyes on her, assessing, calculating. She kept her gaze fixed on the pillar, her hands moving mechanically. There is one in particular, the thick-set man continued, his voice barely a whisper. Works here, at the tavern. Name's Alara, keeps to herself, but she has connections, knows the city like the back of her hand. She might know something or someone who knows something valuable. Alara's blood ran cold. They knew about her, or at least they suspected. She had to get out of there. Now, with a casualness she didn't feel, she straightened up, tossing the rag over her shoulder. More ale, sirs? She asked, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the fear that was churning inside her. The thick-set man's eyes narrowed, but he simply nodded. Aye, and make it a strong one, girl. We have much to discuss. Alara nodded, turning away and heading towards the bar, her mind racing. She had to get away. She had to warn someone. But who? And could she trust anyone? The city suddenly felt a lot smaller, a lot more dangerous, and Alara knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life had just taken a very, very dangerous turn. The silver coins they promised were tempting, but her life, and perhaps the lives of others, was worth far more. All right, let's gently guide our weary traveler, Alara, towards the dubious comforts of medical care in the medieval city. After the tavern brawl, or perhaps a particularly nasty encounter with a disgruntled patron, Alara might find herself in need of, well, let's just say patching up. Forget your antiseptic wipes and sterile bandages. We're stepping back to a time of questionable hygiene and even more questionable medical practices. Finding the healer's hut isn't like popping into your local pharmacy, is it? More like a scavenger hunt through the less savory parts of town. Tucked away in a dimly lit alley, or perhaps clinging precariously to the edge of the city walls, is where you'll often find the humble abode of someone claiming to be a healer. Emphasis on claiming. These weren't exactly licensed physicians with years of training. More often than not, they were wise women, or men, who had learned a thing or two about herbs, poultices, and the general art of, well, hoping for the best. The hut itself, picture this: mud walls, a thatched roof that leaks more than it protects, and a pervasive aroma of dried herbs, questionable tinctures, and possibly something that used to be alive. The lighting is provided by a single tallow candle sputtering weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that make the whole experience even more unsettling. Don't expect comfortable seating. A rickety wooden stool, or maybe a straw-filled sack, will likely be your waiting area. And who might you find tending to the sick and injured? A woman, most likely. In medieval times, formal medical training was largely the domain of men, often associated with the church or universities. Women, however, played a crucial role in providing everyday health care, drawing on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. They might be skilled in midwifery, herbal remedies, and the treatment of common ailments. Of course, their knowledge could be a mixed bag, ranging from genuinely helpful to downright dangerous, depending on their experience and understanding. So Alara shuffles in, perhaps clutching a throbbing arm or nursing a split lip. What remedies await her? Well, first, expect a thorough inspection, and by thorough, I mean the healer poking, prodding, and possibly sniffing the afflicted area. Hygiene, as we've discussed, wasn't exactly a priority, and a diagnosis, let's just say it might involve more guesswork than actual medical science. Blame it on bad humors, an imbalance in the body's fluids, you see. Too much blood, time for some bloodletting. Yep, leeches, a sharp knife, the whole shebang. If Alara's injury is external, expect a poultice, a magical concoction of mashed herbs, animal fat, and maybe a dash of spider webs. Don't ask too many questions, just slather it on and hope for the best. For wounds, expect a healthy dose of something called woundwort, or maybe some honey. Surprisingly, it does have some antiseptic properties to prevent infection. And bandages, ripped strips of linen, probably none too clean, but hey, at least it covers things up. Now, let's say Alara isn't dealing with a simple wound. Perhaps she's suffering from a cough, a fever, or something even more unpleasant. Here's where the herbal remedies really come into play. For a cough, horehound, maybe some licorice root. Fever, willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Not bad actually, but dosage, that's where things get tricky. Too much, and you might end up with a whole new set of problems. And what about other ailments? Let's just say that Alara's profession came with certain occupational hazards. For those, well, the remedies were often less than effective. Mercury, for example, was a common treatment for certain conditions, highly toxic of course, but hey, they thought it was working. And if all else failed, prayer, repentance, and maybe a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. But beyond the dubious medical treatments, there's a human element. The healer might offer Alara a sympathetic ear, a moment of respite from the harsh realities of her life. A cup of herbal tea, a kind word, a shared understanding of the struggles of survival. In a world where compassion was often a rare commodity, these small gestures could mean the world. Of course, all of this comes at a price. Payment might be in the form of coin, a favor, or perhaps a trinket Alara managed to acquire. Bargaining is expected, and the outcome, well, let's just say that sometimes the healer's ministrations actually helped. Other times, they did absolutely nothing. And occasionally, well, let's just hope Alara doesn't end up worse than she started. In the end, Alara leaves the healer's hut, perhaps slightly cleaner, or perhaps not, with a poultice plastered to her wound, and a handful of questionable herbs. Whether she's actually better off remains to be seen, but she has at least taken a step towards healing, in a world where survival often depended on little more than hope, a bit of luck, and the dubious skills of someone claiming to be a healer. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to get her through another day. The night, usually a cloak of secrets and hushed whispers, felt different tonight, thicker, somehow, like a tangible darkness pressing in on Alara as she navigated the cobbled streets. Maybe it was the chill wind, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something acrid, like fear. Or maybe it was just the ever-present awareness that she was a woman alone, walking a path fraught with peril. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, trying to ward off not just the cold but the prickling unease that crawled beneath her skin. Earlier the tavern had been its usual cacophony of drunken laughter, boasting sailors and furtive deals whispered in shadowy corners. She'd managed to turn a few coins, enough for a meager loaf of bread and a handful of dried beans. But something had been off. A tension hung in the air, thicker than the smoke from the poorly maintained hearth. A group of men, faces scarred and eyes like chips of flint, had been watching her. not with the usual lustful gaze, but with a cold, calculating appraisal that made her stomach clench. She'd tried to ignore them, focusing on her work, on the small talk and fleeting moments of connection she could offer her clients. But their presence lingered, a shadow at the edge of her vision. She'd felt their eyes on her back as she left, a silent promise of something unpleasant to come. Now, away from the flickering candlelight and relative safety of the tavern, the promise seemed to solidify. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew these streets like the back of her hand, every alleyway, every darkened doorway, every potential escape route. But tonight they felt different, menacing. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her arm, rough and unyielding. A scream died in her throat as she was yanked into a narrow alleyway, the stench of refuse and stale urine filling her nostrils. The world spun for a moment, and she stumbled, her knees scraping against the rough stones. Well, a voice rasped, laced with a cruel amusement that sent shivers down her spine. Look what we have here, all alone, little bird. She looked up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. 3 men, the same men from the tavern. Their faces, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the buildings, were even more menacing than she remembered. The leader, a hulking brute with a scarred face and a missing tooth, grinned at her, a predatory glint in his eyes. What do you want? She managed to croak, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts. We want what you're selling, little bird, he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. Only, we ain't looking to pay. Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. She knew what they wanted. She'd seen it before, heard the stories. The alleyways of the city were littered with the wreckage of women who'd resisted, but something flickered within her, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She might be small, she might be vulnerable, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. I have no money, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'm just trying to get home. The man laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. Don't play coy with us, girl. We know what you do, and we know you've got something worth taking. He reached for her, his grimy hand closing around her arm. She flinched, but didn't scream. Screaming would only attract more attention, and not necessarily the kind she wanted. Instead, she reacted. Years of living on the streets had taught her a thing or two about survival. She might not be strong, but she was quick. She twisted her body, wrenching her arm free from his grasp. The movement surprised him, and he stumbled back a step. It was all the opening she needed. She lashed out with her foot, aiming for his knee. It connected with a satisfying thud, and he howled in pain, clutching his leg. The other 2 men surged forward, their faces contorted with anger. She knew she couldn't fight them all. Her only chance was to run. She spun around and bolted down the alleyway, her heart pounding in her ears. The men were close behind, their heavy footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing the lead attacker limping after her, his face a mask of fury. The alleyway twisted and turned, a labyrinth of shadows and dead ends. She knew she had to find a way out, a way to reach the relative safety of the main streets. She spotted a gap in the buildings, a narrow opening that led to a small courtyard. She squeezed through, ignoring the sharp edges of the stones that scraped against her skin. The courtyard was deserted, a small oasis of quiet in the heart of the city. But it was also a dead end. A high wall surrounded it, offering no escape. She was trapped. The men burst into the courtyard, their eyes scanning the space. They saw her, cowering against the wall, and a triumphant grin spread across the leader's face. Nowhere left to run, little bird, he said, his voice low and menacing. Now you're going to pay. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then, something happened. A sound, a high-pitched, frantic meow. She opened her eyes. A stray cat, a scrawny creature with matted fur and glowing eyes, was perched on the wall, its gaze fixed on the men. It meowed again, louder this time, its voice filled with a desperate urgency. The men ignored it, focusing on Alara, but the cat didn't give up. It continued to meow, its voice growing more insistent, more frantic. And then it jumped. Not at the men, but at a pile of loose stones stacked against the wall. The stones tumbled down, creating a small avalanche of noise and debris. The men startled, their attention momentarily diverted. It was all the distraction Alara needed. She lunged forward, grabbing a loose stone from the ground. It was small, but heavy. She swung it with all her might, hitting the leader in the face. He cried out in pain, clutching his nose. Blood spurted between his fingers. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. Alara didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, scrambling over the fallen stones. She reached the top of the pile and jumped down into the narrow alleyway on the other side. She didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She ran until she reached the main streets, where the flickering lights of the shops and taverns offered a semblance of safety. She leaned against a building, gasping for breath, her body trembling. She was safe, for now. But she knew that the city was full of dangers, and that she would always be vulnerable. But she was alive, and she had fought back. And that, she realized, was something. The healer's hut now a distant memory. Alara finds herself staring into the flickering candle flame, the only light in her cramped room. The tavern's raucous laughter and drunken shouts are a dull roar behind the thin walls, a constant reminder of the world she inhabits. But tonight, the noise doesn't pull her in, doesn't offer its usual, albeit fleeting, comfort. Tonight, something is different. That child's cry from earlier in the day, the one she had heard, seems to echo in the quiet moments between the tavern noises. It was just a child, alone and frightened, not unlike Alara once felt herself. She sighs, a wisp of air in the cold room. It wasn't just that cry, was it? It's the pawnbroker's greedy eyes, the guard's demanding hands, the endless stream of faces, each one a transaction, each one chipping away at something inside. It's the weariness that settles in her bones each night, a weight no amount of sleep seems to lift. She traces the rim of the chipped ceramic mug, swirling the dregs of watered-down ale. Escape. The word whispers in her mind, a forbidden melody. Escape. From the city, from the life, from the city. The endless cycle. She imagines it. A life beyond these narrow streets, beyond the tavern's smoky haze, beyond the judging eyes and whispered insults. A life where she could walk without fear, where the touch of a hand wasn't always a transaction, where her name meant something more than what it does here. But where would she go? She has no family left. Not since the fever took them years ago. No savings to speak of, just enough coin to scrape by, day to day. The countryside. Alara had heard the horror stories from other women, bandits preying on travelers, unscrupulous farmers taking advantage of desperate hands, the constant threat of starvation and exposure. No. The countryside was no fairy tale. It was another kind of harsh reality. Perhaps a smaller town, somewhere far enough away that her past wouldn't follow, but close enough to the city that she could still manage. Somewhere she could learn a trade. Maybe with her nimble fingers she could be a seamstress, or perhaps a baker. The smell of bread, warm and comforting, fills her imagination for a fleeting moment. A baker, creating something beautiful, something nourishing. Instead of this, but such dreams required coin, and connections, and a reputation. All things Alara lacked. Who would take her in? Who would trust a woman with her history? The whispers would follow, the judging eyes would remain. Could she ever truly escape the shadows of her past? Alara rises and shuffles to the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The candlelight casts long shadows, making her face appear gaunt and hollow. She peers closely, searching for the girl she once was, the one who still believed in dreams. Is she still there, buried beneath the layers of survival, beneath the masks she wears each day? There was Martha, the milkmaid from up north. She'd left her hometown after an incident with a local farmer, had told Alara all about her simple life. Milking cows, tending chickens, mending fences. Hard work, Martha would always say, but honest work. You sleep soundly at night when you earn your bread that way. Alara hadn't understood that sentiment then. Now it resonates with a painful clarity. Martha saved up for months, pinching every penny, until she had enough to buy a small plot of land outside the city. Alara hadn't seen her in a while, probably moved back to her village with enough money saved, or maybe found a husband. But how? How could she even begin to make such a drastic change? Selling her few possessions wouldn't yield enough to buy a decent meal, let alone finance a journey and a new life. Perhaps if she was clever, she could save a little bit each day, hide a few coins from the tavern keeper, deny herself that extra piece of bread. It would be slow, painstaking, but it was a start. And what about the dangers? Traveling alone was a fool's errand. She'd be easy prey for thieves, or worse. Maybe she could find someone to travel with, someone she could trust. But trust was a rare and precious commodity in this world. Most were looking out for themselves, willing to exploit anyone who crossed their path. Alara returns to her cot and lies down, pulling the threadbare blanket around her. The tavern noises seem to have intensified, the laughter louder, more mocking. It's as if the city itself is taunting her, daring her to dream of escape. But despite the doubts, despite the fears, despite the overwhelming odds, a flicker of hope ignites within her. It's a small flame, fragile and easily extinguished, but it's there. The seed of a possibility, the whisper of a dream. She closes her eyes, picturing that small town, the smell of baking bread, the feel of rough fabric beneath her fingers, the sound of honest laughter. A life beyond the shadows, a life of her own making. Escape. It's not just a word anymore. It's a goal, a purpose, a reason to keep going. Even when the path seems impossible, Alara drifts into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with visions of open fields and winding roads and a future that for the first time in a long time feels possible. A future where she finally gets to choose. A future where she can finally sleep soundly. The decision, it hangs heavy, doesn't it? Like a sodden blanket on a clothesline. Stay here, in this city, within these familiar, albeit squalid, walls, or risk the unknown. It's a question Alara wrestles with as she stares out at the pre-dawn sky, a sky the color of bruised plums. Staying, well, that's the devil she knows. The routines are etched in her bones. She knows the rhythm of the streets, the faces of the guards, and how much it costs to grease their palms. The best places to find scraps of food. The other women, her sisters in survival, even though their sisterhood is often more rivalry than genuine affection. There's a grim sort of comfort in the predictable. She knows how to navigate the dangers, how to read the subtle shifts in mood of a potential client, how to deflect unwanted advances with a practiced smile and a sharp word. She knows who to trust, or rather, who to trust least. Staying means staying alive. At least that's what her weary mind keeps whispering. Each day is a battle, yes, a constant negotiation for survival, but she's winning the battle, or at least she hasn't lost yet. She has a small stash of coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard, enough for a few days, maybe even a week, of relative security. Enough to stave off starvation, to afford a temporary respite from the elements, to nurse a brewing cough with a bit of honeyed ale. And then there's the knowledge she's gleaned, the secrets overheard, the whispers of discontent that flutter through the city like restless birds. She's heard things, important things, things that could be worth a lot of silver. Things that could buy her more than just survival. Things that could buy her freedom. But that freedom is tied to this city. It's a gamble, a dangerous game, but it's a game she understands. She knows the players, the stakes, the potential rewards. To leave now would be to abandon that opportunity, to throw away a chance, however slim, to improve her lot. But the city, it's also a cage, a gilded cage perhaps for some, but a cage nonetheless. The stench, the poverty, the ever-present threat of violence, it wears her down, little by little, day by day. She sees the toll it takes on the other women, the spark fading in their eyes, the hope slowly leaching away. Is that her future? To become another hollow shell, a ghost haunting these narrow streets, and the rumors, whispers of plague, making its way to the city, carried on the backs of rats, and the breath of traders from far-off lands. The city walls, meant to protect, could become a tomb, a gilded cage perhaps for some, but a cage nonetheless. The stench, the poverty, the ever-present threat of violence, it wears her down, little by little, day by day. She sees the toll it takes on the other women, the spark fading in their eyes, the hope slowly leaching away. Is that her future? To become another hollow shell, a ghost haunting these narrow streets. So what about leaving? What lies beyond those city gates? She's heard stories, of course, tales of sprawling forests, of fertile fields, of quiet villages where honest work is rewarded with a simple, peaceful life. Tales that sound like, well, tales, fairy stories whispered to wide-eyed children. She has no skills, no trade other than the one that keeps her fed, barely. Here, who would take her in? What could she offer? She can't read or write. She has no dowry, no family to vouch for her. She's just Alara, a woman with a past she'd rather forget, and a future that seems as bleak as the winter sky. And then there's the road itself. Bandits roam the countryside, preying on travelers. The roads are rough, dangerous, and lonely. A woman alone, well, she'd be easy prey. And the guards, the city guards are corrupt, but the ones patrolling the roads beyond, they are often worse. They take what they want, and there's no one to stop them. But wouldn't anything be better than this? Than the constant fear, the daily degradation, the knowledge that her body is simply a commodity bought and sold like a loaf of bread? Surely, even the risk of starvation, of violence, of loneliness, surely that's better than slowly dying inside, day after day. In this city of shadows, she thinks of the open sky, the clean air, the possibility of a fresh start, a place where no one knows her name, where she can create a new identity, a new life. A place where she can be free, really free. It's a terrifying thought, this freedom. She's spent so long surviving within the confines of this city that the prospect of the unknown is almost paralyzing. But it's also exhilarating. A tiny spark of hope ignites within her, flickering in the darkness. The weight of the decision presses down on her, heavy as stone. Stay and cling to the familiar, the predictable, the devil she knows, or risk everything, embrace the unknown, and gamble on a future that might be brighter, or far, far darker. The sky begins to lighten, the bruised plums fading to a pale, watery blue. The city is beginning to stir, the sounds of its awakening, a cacophony of carts rattling, voices shouting, dogs barking. Time is running out. She must decide, stay or go, life or a gamble for. It's all she has to play, and what will the outcome bring? She is left to wonder, with all of herself hanging precariously in the balance. All right, let's settle in for a moment, shall we? Alara's decision is made, the die is cast. Staying wasn't an option, not a real one anyway. Now comes the hard part, saying goodbye, preparing for the unknown. It's not all dramatic pronouncements and burning bridges. Mostly, it's quiet things, small things, easily overlooked. First, there's her little room. Not much to it really. A straw-stuffed mattress that's seen better decades, a rickety stool, a chipped wash basin, but it's hers. It's been her haven, her prison, well, her everything for longer than she cares to remember. She runs a hand over the rough wooden walls, feeling the ingrained grime, the faint echoes of whispered secrets and stifled sobs. Does the room know she's leaving? Does it care? Probably not. It's just a room. Still, she lingers, taking it all in, committing it to memory. A mental snapshot, perhaps, for a future she can barely imagine. Then there's the practical stuff. What to take, what to leave behind. She has so little, and yet it feels like everything. Her worn woolen cloak, patched more times than she can count, but warm against the biting wind. It goes. The small tarnished silver locket she keeps hidden beneath her dress, a memento of a life before, a face she struggles to recall. It goes, tucked securely inside her bodice. A few meager coins, painstakingly set, enough to buy a loaf of bread and maybe a night's lodging. They definitely go. But what about the rest? A small wooden doll, missing an arm, a childhood relic. It stayed too bulky, too sentimental. It would only weigh her down, both physically and emotionally. A half-finished embroidery, a fleeting attempt at respectability. It stayed. A reminder of dreams deferred, perhaps best left forgotten. The hardest part is the farewells. Ilara doesn't have family. Not anymore, but she has acquaintances, friends of a sort, the other women. Women who understand, who share her burdens, who offer a fleeting glimpse of camaraderie in a cruel world. There's Bronwyn, the eldest, her face etched with the map of hard living, her eyes holding a weary wisdom. Bronwyn doesn't say much, but her silence speaks volumes. She knows what Ilara is doing, and she understands why. A nod, a brief, almost imperceptible squeeze of the hand. Be careful, she rasps, her voice roughened by years of cheap ale and harsher words. The world ain't kind to women on their own. Ilara knows this, she's lived it, but it's still good to hear somehow. A validation, a reminder that she's not alone, not entirely. Then there's Maeve, the youngest, barely more than a girl, her eyes still holding a spark of innocence that Ilara fears will soon be extinguished. Maeve clings to her, tears welling in her eyes. Don't go, she whispers, her voice trembling. What will I do without you? Ilara hates this part. She hates leaving Maeve behind, exposed to the wolves that prowl the city streets. But she can't save everyone. She can barely save herself. She forces a smile, a brittle facade of optimism. You're stronger than you think, she says, her voice husky with emotion. You'll be all right. Just be smart. Be careful, and don't let anyone steal your light. She hands Maeve a small, intricately carved wooden bead, a trinket she's carried for years. For luck, she says, her voice barely a whisper. There are others too. Brief encounters, fleeting goodbyes, a quick word to the tavern keeper, a gruff but fair man who's always treated her with a modicum of respect, a nod to the baker who sometimes slips her an extra crust of bread. Small gestures of kindness, easily forgotten, but deeply appreciated. Finally, there's the street itself, the familiar cobblestones, stained with filth and refuse, the cacophony of sounds, the hawkers' cries, the clatter of carts, the rumble of wagon wheels, the smells, a pungent mix of sewage, spices and stale beer. It's a sensory overload, a chaotic symphony of urban decay. But it's her street. She knows every nook and cranny, every hidden alleyway, every treacherous pothole. She takes a deep breath, filling her lungs with the foul air, etching the scene into her memory. As she walks away, she doesn't look back. Not yet. She can't afford to. She has to focus on the future, on the unknown path ahead. But in her heart, she carries a piece of this place, a fragment of this life, a reminder of where she's been, and a burning hope for where she's going. It's not a triumphant departure, no grand pronouncements or soaring music, just a quiet escape, a whispered goodbye, a desperate gamble for a better life. She walks into the crowd, becoming just another face in the throng, another anonymous soul seeking her fortune in a world that offers few guarantees. The sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. The night is coming, and with it, the unknown. Ilara pulls her cloak tighter around her and walks on. The cocks crow, a jarring, insistent sound that rips through the pre-dawn stillness. Ilara stirs, not to the dawn, which is still a shy thing, barely hinting at its arrival, but to the clatter and commotion of the city awakening. It's a new day, and God help her, a new life. She's not in the familiar cramped room above the crooked tankard. That much is immediately clear. The air here smells different, cleaner, less imbued with the stale scent of ale, sweat, and cheap perfume. Instead, there's an earthy aroma, a hint of wood smoke and something floral. She can't quite place it. She sits up, pushing aside a rough-spun blanket. It's coarse against her skin, a far cry from the threadbare, vaguely satin sheet she'd grown accustomed to. This new bed is firmer too, filled with something other than the lumpy straw of her previous existence. Feathers, perhaps. If so, they are of a humble origin, but more comfortable and clean than anything Alara's known. She looks around. This isn't a grand chamber, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's a small room, sparsely furnished. A wooden chest sits against one wall, its surface scratched and worn. A small round table occupies the center of the room, and a crudely made stool is tucked beneath it. A single small window, partially obscured by a woven curtain, offers a glimpse of the outside world, a world shrouded in the pale grey light that precedes the sunrise. It is quiet. Too quiet. She remembers the events of the previous night with a painful clarity. The whispers, the furtive glances, the clandestine meeting in the shadowed alleyway. The deal struck, the coin exchanged, the promise of a new beginning, and then the jolting ride in the back of a farmer's cart, hidden beneath a pile of hay, until the first streaks of dawn kissed the horizon. She's miles away from the city she has come to resent, miles from the familiar faces, both friendly and menacing, of her former life, miles from the judgments, the whispers, and the shame. But is she free? That's the question that hangs heavy in the air, a question as thick and uncertain as the dawn itself. The woman who helped Alara leave, Agnes, had promised her a new start, a life of honest work, away from the shadows and the dangers of her previous existence. She paints a picture of green fields, fresh air, and the simple satisfaction of labor. But Alara isn't naive. She knows that nothing comes without a price, and she knows that Agnes didn't offer her this escape out of the goodness of her heart. There's something else at play, some unspoken obligation, some debt yet to be repaid. The thought sends a shiver down her spine, a chill that has nothing to do with the morning air. She pushes the blanket aside and stands, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. She moves to the window and pulls back the curtain, peering out at the world outside. A small cottage garden stretches out before her, overgrown with herbs and flowers. Beyond the garden, rolling fields fade into the misty distance. It is idyllic, peaceful, and utterly unfamiliar. This is a world far removed from the narrow, crowded streets of the city, from the stench of the taverns and the grime of the alleys. This is a world of green and blue, of earth and sky, a world where the sun rises without casting long, suspicious shadows. But even here, in this seemingly tranquil setting, Alara can sense the presence of unseen dangers. The world is never a wholly safe place, especially not for someone like her. The quiet can be deceptive, the peace fragile. There is work to be done, obviously, and her contribution is expected. She is to earn her keep, though Agnes was somewhat vague about that. Alara's not entirely sure what lies ahead. She doesn't know what kind of work she'll be doing, who she'll be working for, or what kind of people she'll be surrounded by. She doesn't know if she'll be accepted, or if she'll always be seen as an outsider, a woman with a tainted past. She is to start over, though it feels like she is starting from nothing. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves of the trees, and Alara closes her eyes, taking a deep breath of the clean, fresh air. It fills her lungs, clearing away the lingering scent of the city. For the first time in a long time, she feels a flicker of hope, a fragile spark of possibility, but it's quickly tempered by the weight of reality. She has a past that clings to her like a shroud, a past that could easily unravel this new life before it even begins. She is branded in the city, marked as one of the fallen, and then there is Agnes to consider. What does she want from Alara? What sacrifices will be demanded in return for this chance at a new beginning? She thinks of her friends, the women she has left behind. Will they be all right? She wonders if they will miss her. As the first rays of sunlight begin to peek over the horizon, Alara opens her eyes, her gaze hardening with a newfound determination. She doesn't know what the future holds, but she knows one thing: she will fight for it. She will fight for this chance to escape the shadows, to build a life of her own, to find some measure of peace and redemption. This freedom, if it is truly hers, will not be forfeited easily. But she is not naive. The path ahead is long and uncertain. It could lead to freedom, to a life of peace and contentment, or it could lead to a tragic end, a final fall from grace, a fate even darker than the one she left behind. The only thing she knows for sure is that her journey has just begun. She does not know if the uncertainties are a promise or a threat. She shivers, looks to the horizon, and steels herself for what comes next. It will, at the very least, be an adventure, and one she cannot, under any circumstance, fail to survive.